Welcome back, capital F football fans, to the O&O Sports YouTube channel. And it is official. We have reached the end of the season previews. Thank you guys for all your support on this series. We appreciate it a lot. And we hope you'll stick around for the next series, which is our conference predictions. We'll have a brand new poll up for you after this video in the community tab if you want to vote on the first conference prediction. And last week you voted, and today we have the last team. It is the Ole Miss Rebels. Starting off for Ole Miss, let's go over a 2023 recap. What went wrong, what went right. Starting off with what went wrong. The first thing that went wrong for the Rebels was third downs. They were bad on both sides, both offensively and defensively. 102nd in the country in third down conversion percentage. Only converted on 34.6% of their third downs. Not very great. And likewise, they were 74th nationally in opponent third down conversion rate. Opponents converted on Ole Miss 40% of the time. Definitely not what you want to see. Obviously, you want to have a higher third down conversion percentage than your opponents. And when the margin is that wide, it's not going to lend well in your favor. Ole Miss wasn't bad because of this. This wasn't their biggest issue necessarily, but obviously they couldn't stay on the field when it mattered, and they couldn't get their opponents off the field. The second thing that went wrong is the pass protection. To put it simple, it was just very mediocre. 74th in quarterback sacked per game. Jackson Dart was sacked just over 2 times a game, 2.2 to be exact, and 79th in quarterback sacked percentage. In almost 7% of their plays, Jackson Dart was sacked. Not very good numbers, obviously. Gonna need to improve this year. Jackson Dart was pretty good last year despite that, but getting into the top 50 is going to be crucial for them. And for the next thing that went wrong, it was just defense in general. The pass defense was not very good. 77th in opponent pass yards per game with 236.8. 77th in opponent completion percentage per game. Opponents completed over 61% of their passes on Ole Miss. 72nd in opponent passing yards per completion, over 12 yards per completion on Ole Miss's defense last season, and 61st in opponent passer rating. Quarterbacks averaged a 132 passer rating, which is a good bit above average. Definitely not great numbers from a pass coverage perspective, and the rush defense likewise was also not very good. Teams ran against Ole Miss over 52.5% of the time, and they averaged 158 rushing yards per game on Ole Miss with over 4 yards per carry. Obviously, there were a lot of good run offenses in the SEC, but averaging those numbers is not going to lend well, especially in the SEC, to a positive outcome. And the red zone defense also wasn't that great. They were 86th in opponent red zone scoring percentage. When opponents got inside the 25, they scored on Ole Miss 85.4% of the time. Borderline unacceptable, but not the worst we've seen in this series. Obviously going to need to correct a lot of issues on defense, and we'll get more into that when we talk about 2024. For the last thing that went wrong, it was the penalties. This is what really hurt Ole Miss last year. They were tied for 120th in penalties per game, 7.2. Very, very bad numbers there. Obviously, there's only 134 teams, and if you're in the bottom 15 in that, you're obviously not a great team in that metric. 101st in penalty yards per game, a little bit better. If you're gonna give up a lot of penalties, hopefully you're not giving up a lot of big penalties, and it seems like they weren't, but obviously not great still. And that's what went wrong. What went right for Ole Miss? Well, for one, the scoring was phenomenal. They were 28th in points per game, almost 32 points scored on average. They were 37th in points per play, 33rd in red zone scoring percentage. When they got inside the 25, they scored a little bit over 88% of the time. And they were tied for 10th in second half points per game with 17 flat. And what I haven't seen a lot of people talk about is that second half points per game. They're a very good second half scoring team, tied for 10th, like we said, in the country. And the next thing that went right is Jackson Dart. Dart has had a pretty up and down career, but last year he was very, very good. Completed over 65% of his passes, threw for over 3,300 yards, 23 touchdowns, and had a 162.4 passer rating. And on top of those passing numbers, he also rushed for almost 390 yards and 8 more touchdowns. He was very crucial for that Ole Miss offense last year, made a big impact, was one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC, honestly, and that is why you'll see a lot of publications rating him higher on the SEC quarterbacks list. He's honestly top 4, could make a case for top 3, probably not top 2, but he's up there for sure. And the third thing that went right for Ole Miss last year was the pass rush. This is the one shining spot on defense, and it's probably the most important spot on the defense, if we're being honest. They were 28th in sacks per game, a little bit over 2.5. They won that margin because they did give up a little bit over 2 sacks per game, but they completed over 2.6, so pretty good numbers there. And they were 35th in sack percentage with 7.5%. Pretty good, all things considered. Maybe not elite, but good in both of those categories. On the right track. Definitely, like we said, the shining spot of that defense. And the last thing that went right, the turnovers were amazing for Ole Miss. They were first in giveaways per game, and no, that does not mean they gave up the most. It means they gave up the least. Exactly 0.5 giveaways per game. They held onto the ball tight. They did not give it up. They never coughed it up. They were very good with the ball. That is obviously exactly what you want to see if you're Lane Kiffin, if you're the offensive coordinator, if you're the defensive coordinator. Obviously, the offensive coordinator doesn't want to give it up, but the defense is also just as happy because they don't have to be on the field as much. And they were tied for 9th in turnover margin per game, plus 0.8 in the turnover margin. Anytime you're positive, you're going to be happy, but they were overwhelmingly positive, one of the best turnover margins in the sport last season. And that was it for the 2023 recap. Let's get straight into 2024. Starting off with the schedule, Ole Miss is going to take on Furman FCS at home, Middle Tennessee State at home, then go on the road, surprisingly, versus Wake Forest. Back at home versus Georgia Southern, back at home versus Kentucky, on the road to Willie B at South Carolina, on the road to Death Valley to face LSU, and then a bye week. Then they get Oklahoma at home, Arkansas on the road, Georgia at home, another bye week, Florida on the road, and Mississippi State at home. Obviously, this is going to be a very difficult schedule, but there's a lot of potential upside with the craftsmanship of this schedule. And by that, I mean there's a pretty easy non-conference schedule leading directly into a home game versus a decent but not great Kentucky, then a tough road environment at South Carolina, into a big game against LSU. So you get to warm up with the cupcakes, then you get Kentucky at home. Should be a very good SEC game. Get you warmed up for the SEC schedule, and then you get South Carolina, very tough road environment, but overall probably not a great team. In preparation for LSU, obviously you don't want to look either Kentucky or South Carolina, but there's a solid amount of warm up for the SEC, and then once you get into the SEC, there's a lot of good warm up for the tougher SEC teams. And then you get Oklahoma and Georgia at home, sandwiched in between your 2 bye weeks. And if you're going to play those teams, obviously you want to play them at home. It's still obviously going to be an uphill battle, but whoever makes the schedules for Ole Miss cooked this year. What about Ole Miss's strengths? Well, their first strength is going to be their offense. Jackson Dart, like we talked about, is fantastic. Didn't look great in his first year at Ole Miss in 2022. He took a big leap forward and was more precise and efficient in 2023. And if that pattern continues, he should be in for an even better year this year, en route to a high draft pick, most likely. And that wide receiver room is also absolutely loaded. We went over it in our top 10 offenses video. If you haven't seen that, be sure to check it out after this video. They returned 2 of their top 3 wide receivers from 2023, one of them being Trey Harris, who's probably one of the better wide receivers in the country, and they add an uber-talented transfer in South Carolina's Juice Wells. And on top of that star talent to round out the top of the room, they add a lot of great young talent to bolster that bottom of that rotation. And the running back room is also very good. They obviously took a big hit by losing Quinshon Judkins to Ohio State, but they arguably got better as an overall room. They returned Ulysses Bentley, who got a number of reps behind Judkins, and they add Miami, Florida running back Henry Parrish, who was solid for Miami last year, and then Miami of Ohio running back Rashad Amos, who was an all-MAC conference award-winning running back last year. And the offensive line is coming in even stronger than it was last year. They were a pretty decent unit last year, but overall not outstanding. And coming in this season is Washington's 2 starting guards in Nate Kalepo and Julius Buelo. And they portal in a lot of other great depth and potential starters in North Carolina's Diego Pounds and Southern Miss's Jerquan Scott. like we said, wasn't a great overall unit, but they had so much depth and starting talent that it's hard to believe that they won't be considerably better this year. And other than the offense, the defense honestly is going to be another strength. Starting off with the defensive line, they return big contributors in Jared Ivey, JJ Pegways, Suntarine Perkins, Akello Stone, and Xavier Harris. Those 5 defensive linemen combined for 84 solo tackles, 31 tackles for loss, and 16 sacks and a forced fumble. And they add number 2 overall transfer portal recruit Walter Nolan from Texas A&M, who was an absolute monster, a generational talent. And they also add Princely Umanmielen from Florida, who is also very, very talented. Those 2 alone combined for over 42 solo tackles, 20 tackles for loss, and 11 sacks in 2023. And those numbers are just ridiculous. If you rewind it, you'll notice that those 2 alone combined for over half of what 5 people did for Ole Miss last year. And they were a pretty good unit already in 2023, but they have definitely upgraded to potentially one of the best D-lines in the SEC and maybe even the country this year. Apart from the defensive line, the linebackers are also very solid. They bring back Kerry Coleman, who's probably going to be their best returning linebacker from last season. He had 32 solo tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks, and a forced fumble, which are pretty respectable numbers. And they bring in Arkansas's Chris Paul Jr., not related to the basketball player, surprisingly. 30 solo tackles for Chris Paul, 6.5 tackles for loss, and 2 sacks. Also very respectable numbers. Overall, not their strongest area defensively, but they have great depth there, which we'll get more into later, and not bad at all in terms of talent by any stretch of the imagination. As for the secondary, the pass coverage was definitely not a strong suit last year, probably the worst area on the team as a whole, but they bring in a number of key transfers in Trey Amos from Alabama, Isaiah Hamilton from Houston, Brandon Turnage from Tennessee, Key Lawrence from Oklahoma, Yam Banks from Southern Alabama, and Lewis Moore from Indiana. And it feels like Lane Kiffin and Pete Golding are implementing the tried and true, if it doesn't work, bring in a bunch of guys method on defense, which should honestly be a massive upgrade from last year. When you have the rotational pieces that you've brought in, it takes a lot of baggage off that unit. And honestly, just like the defensive line and linebackers, we think they should be a massively improved unit this season. And for their last strength, it's going to be the depth. Like we talked about previously, for the offense and defense, each unit has a very good to elite amount of depth, especially the defensive line, especially the secondary. And that's because they were 3rd in the transfer portal rankings according to On3. And most surprisingly, they completed the transfer portal triple crown this offseason. They brought in more people than they lost in the portal. They portaled in depth, and they portaled in starting or star talent. If there was an offseason national championship, Ole Miss, I feel like, would be the front runner. And those are the strengths. What about weaknesses? There's really only one weakness that we can definitively point out for Ole Miss, and that's going to be team inexperience. With almost every good thing in college football, there's always a caveat. They did portal in a lot, and that is great. But the biggest question is, will there be a big learning curve for those transfer portal players and for the team overall? And the answer to that is going to be yes. But it's not really that simple. There's going to be a learning curve, but then you have to figure out how big of a learning curve it's going to be. And when you bring in as many people as you do, it's never going to be a sure thing. Obviously not a bad thing. You add a lot of talent, you add a lot of depth like we talked about, but it's still going to be a big question mark. Things could go wrong, but more than likely they won't. It does bring a risk of muddying the waters a bit, but if you're Pete Golding, if you're Lane Kiffin, if you're Charlie Weiss, you can live with that and prepare your team to the fullest. And that's it for the overview. Let's get into the 2024 prediction. But first, as always, we have our keys to success for Ole Miss in this season. The first key to success, plain and simple, is just going to be Jackson Dart. It's no secret that the offensive output hinges on how good the quarterback plays, and that is especially true for Ole Miss. Last year, when Dart was slicing up offenses, Ole Miss looked like one of the best teams in the country. But when he was off a little bit, when he played a little bit, maybe average or even mediocre, the team looked average. Now, the former happened way more often than the latter, but the point remains. Going to be very important for Jackson Dart to get going, and it shouldn't be that hard with the weapons he's going to have heading into the season. The second key to success is going to be the rush defense, and it is imperative for Ole Miss to improve all around defensively this year, but we feel like the run defense especially is important. There are no shortage of good quarterbacks in the SEC, don't get us wrong, but there are also a lot of great run games, and the key to stopping those SEC offenses is significantly weakening the run game, as that is what is going to keep them stabilized, because when a team knows they can rush for 4 to 5 yards on you every play, they're not going to be afraid to pass it on you either, take you over the top, because the fallback is a second down big chunk rushing play. And the last key to success is going to be the takeaways for Ole Miss. Now, we talked about how Ole Miss was able to secure the ball and not cough it up hardly ever last year, which is obviously fantastic, but the issue is that they didn't capitalize on it by taking the ball away a lot. They were tied for 88th in takeaways per game with 1.3 per game, and if they were a top 15 team in takeaways to go along with the best team at not coughing up the ball, you're looking at an SEC contending Ole Miss Rebels team last year, and it's important for them to continue not turning over the ball, obviously, in 2024. Obviously, we're not saying that's not important, but it is even more crucial that they start taking it away more if they want to potentially make it to the SEC championship and represent the SEC in the college football playoff and get that first game bye. And those were the keys to success. Let's get into the final grades for Ole Miss. The offense is going to come out to a 95.0. Ole Miss is going to be stellar once again on offense this year, and with Dart poised to take one small step into becoming a near elite quarterback, and with the talent on the O-line and in the skill positions, it's hard to believe Ole Miss won't be one of the best offenses in the country this year. And as for the defense, we would probably have them much lower had they not brought in Walter Nolan and Uman Mielen. But since they do bring in those guys, along with a lot of great guys in the secondary, they're getting bumped up to a 92.5. Pretty great defense all around, all things considered. And as for the special teams, we haven't really talked about them a lot in this video, or at all in this video. They're going to come out to an 88.5. Place kicker Caden Davis and punter Frazier Martin were both pretty good, but not really exceptional last year. They should come in and get the job done once again. That's really all you can ask for from the specialists, but they're not a great unit, but they're definitely far from a bad unit. As for the coaching, Ole Miss is going to shake out to a 91.0. If we factored in entertainment value, this number would bump up tremendously. Lane Kiffin, probably the most entertaining coach in sport. Unfortunately, we do not. But so far in his first 4 seasons in Oxford, Kiffin and his staff have done wonders for Ole Miss. 3 great years out of the 4, and the first season was the 2020 year, so you can't really fault them there. As for the strength of schedule, it's going to come out to a 94.5. By nature of the beast, SEC schedules are probably going to be higher than most other schedules, but it's not bad overall, like we talked about at the beginning of this video. The spacing is there for Ole Miss to make a pretty great run this year. Definitely possible, but still very difficult. And that's going to bring them out to an overall of 92.3. Ole Miss was a pretty top-heavy team last year. The offense commanded the ship for most part, and when the defense wasn't awful, they were a pretty good team. But this year, the defense shouldn't be even close to how big of a liability they were last year, and that is what we believe will make all the difference for them. And with that being said, let's get into the final predictions. The ceiling for Ole Miss is going to be 11-1 with a 7-1 conference record. Ole Miss is obviously insanely talented, but we feel like there's one team on their schedule to the east that's just a little bit more talented, a little bit more solid. And this would obviously still be an amazing season for Ole Miss, and they'd potentially be heading to the SEC championship with this record in a rematch versus the Bulldogs. As for the floor, it's going to be a 9-3 with a 5-3 conference record. In this scenario, it would probably look a lot like 2023, and that the offense looks really good, but the defense is a liability once again, and they end up costing Ole Miss a few close games against their tougher opponents. And for the final prediction for Ole Miss, we are predicting they're going to go 10-2 with a 6-2 conference record. We think Lane Kiffin's going to bag another 10-win season for the Rebels, probably a playoff appearance. But stick around on the channel to see our playoff predictions. Those are going to come after the conference predictions. We think Ole Miss has the raw potential to hit their ceiling, but they're going to have some tough road games that we feel like might be too much to handle for them. Like we've said so many times throughout this video, still a massively talented overall team. We think Lane Kiffin is great. We think his coordinators are great. But it's going to take a lot for them to win the SEC. We think it is possible, but we are not predicting that this year, unfortunately, for the Rebels. Still a great season and still going to have a chance to prove a lot of people wrong, prove us wrong even in the playoff. And that is going to do it for this season preview, and that is going to do it for the season previews for this upcoming season. Like we said, please stay tuned for the conference predictions this year and the playoff predictions. We've got a lot more in store. We are not done yet. Job's not finished. We do appreciate the support on this series. And if you want to directly participate in the uploads you see on this channel, go to the community tab right now and tap on which conference you want to see get a conference prediction first. And as always, we appreciate you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.